What I'm trying to do today, so initially I talked to you a little bit about how investors look at this space and why we like AdAlta, and then I will leave it at the end a little bit for questions if you have questions. Having done this job for 14 years looking at biotechs globally, so I don't know whether you're familiar with Platinum Asset Management, so we're mainly focused on international equities but sitting in Australia. So one of the things that we're very happy with is that we are away from the noise that is Wall Street or European stock exchanges, because that means we can do our own work. People can't reach us, they can't bug us about go look at this, do that. So we basically can ignore everything and do our own opinion. That works sometimes, not all the time, but I have to say it is a much easier job than listening to the noise that's out there. So that often also means that we're a bit earlier in other things, in stocks that we like and in technologies that we think are important. And whereas Wall Street tends to be, they're a bit like a herd mentality, what they do. So one of the things that we obviously always think about is, so the stock market tends to basically value things ahead of time. So what we always look at, particularly in healthcare, is what is the next big thing? What's the next platform? What's the next drug? What's the next disease area? What's the next technology for life science tool companies, and where can we basically make money over the long term? So one of the things that Platinum prides itself in is we're not short-term based, so it's all about, we have stocks in the fund that we had for the last 10 years. We tend to go, particularly in healthcare, on a journey with companies. We don't mind when things fall over. We actually like that, because that means a company has to really pull together, think about, you know, what have we done wrong, what do we have to do right, and companies that do come out of something like that tend to be a lot stronger, and often the second drug or second product will actually work. So now, why do I start with Paul Ehrlich? So one of the things is I'm German by background. I grew up in Germany, and I grew up where this institute is basically the next town to. So it has been very influential to me, and when I was younger my dad took me there, and that basically made me do science. But the other part that Paul Ehrlich has done is he basically formulated something which is called the Sidechain Theory, which is basically the start of antibodies. So one of the things that we like to do at Platinum is we like to understand the history of companies, the history of technologies, and the history of what's actually happening in throughout time. Because often when you look at history, it tends to repeat itself, and you can see different patterns, and you can actually make money out of that. So I found that quite fascinating, because actually that early on he realized what Paul Ehrlich looked at was, he basically said, you know, you've got cells, and these cells have so-called side chains on the top of on their surface. And what happens is when they're under attack or something comes into the body, these side chains bind these, now we know they're antigens, and then what the cell does, it produces more and more side chains that then get spitted into the blood, and that's, today we know that's antibodies. So that kind of what he thought, this is all, these side chains are the magic bullet that we have, and today that's the antibodies. So this is kind of how Platinum, or how I look at the world of healthcare. And it's interesting when you talk to generalists who are not really specialists in healthcare, they get always worried about biotech. Biotech, basically everything falls over, it's difficult, we don't really understand it, and I'd rather stay away and buy, for example, maybe big pharma. But that's a problem because they have patent issues, so I don't like them. There's cost inflation, I don't like this, so cost deflationary, so I don't really like this. So when I then put this slide up to them, they're like, oh, I've never really thought of myself as a consumer in this kind of industry. And that's what we are. So we're all consumers of this system, we all live in this system, and as an investor, you can play any part of this. So you can invest in hospitals, you can invest in America what's called the pharmaceutical benefit managers, you can invest in insurers, in consumer as well, over-the-counter products, and all sorts of other things. But what we focus on mainly is the innovators. We also look at generic companies, and we look at who's helping the innovators do what they can do. There could be CROs, there could be life science tool companies, software in particular, IT is quite important now, and that's kind of what we focus on, innovation. And I often have a hard time at work, because most people are there generalists, to explain that the innovation in this field is huge and there's lots and lots happening, which often makes my job a bit harder to understand what to actually look at. So I looked back, so I put into Google, if you just type in, what are over the last decade, big innovations. And one of the things that comes up very quickly is, well, antibodies have basically changed the way drug development is done or what drugs we have today. But then if you look back, interestingly, in history again, and go back to the deal that Roche did when it licensed or started, I think it was in 1990, if I remember correctly, when they did a deal with Genentech, which was quite revolutionary at the time. Most people thought, like, well, what are these antibodies? That's like, why would we want to have these antibodies? We like small molecules. And so people thought, like, well, I'm not sure what you're doing, Roche, there with this, but let's see. Well, today, everyone wants antibodies. And if you look at pipelines of pharma companies, all they want is these antibodies because they're sustainable. Patents are supposedly obviously better, but you don't have these generic onslaughts. But that we'll be telling this year, really, when Roche is a bit under attack. So anyway, antibodies are what everyone loves. The other innovation that really has happened is targeted therapy. And so I use Gleevec as an example. That was quite revolutionary, and probably you can both attest to that at some stage Novartis, or it was Ciba-Geigy at the time, didn't really want to develop this drug, but then ultimately they realized this is actually quite big, and that really made them a lot of money today. But there's other targeted therapy, and out of that really, the importance of targeted therapy was also helped by what happened to sequencing. So this is a nice chart that I sometimes quite interesting, and generalists tends to like it, is the costs have obviously come down, how much it costs us to do sequencing. It's much, much easier to do it, so we've become much more productive. So there has been a lot of money being made in that area. And to us, we, for example, look at sequencing probably a bit differently and say, well, I don't really want to own the box, how you do it. We actually say, well, we want to look at the IT and all of that, how you actually can figure out what this data actually means. So that's where we're focusing our investments these days. The other great innovation has been HIV and HCV, the combination therapies. And the other part, I think, is the emergence of minimal invasive surgery in medtech, which has quite changed how surgeons do their job today. So that's kind of what is the past, really. So the question is now, what is the future? So the future will still be, obviously, antibodies. And what actually happened over the last 25 years, to give you a little bit of perspective, is, so if you go and look at the approvals, so over the last 25 years, basically on average, 2 to 3 new antibodies have been approved. So no surprise that I think about 7 out of the top 10 drugs these days of sales are antibodies. So again, this comic says is the most devoted defender. I think actually it's the most devoted therapeutic modality that probably fits better. So this is the antibody. So most of you, a lot of you already know what an antibody looks like. It has all these different 2 arms, and it's got another kind of region here. And what happened over the last many years is that scientists obviously have learned to manipulate every possible part of this, this structure. And what that has meant is there's lots of different new things happening and lots of different new opportunities. And often each of these opportunities comes with a new company that you could invest in. So that is quite striking. That's how we started, or how we look at the molecule that we looked at. And this is kind of, for example, this is an example which kind of highlights how it has evolved since we basically found out that we want to use these antibodies as therapeutics. So this goes back to the 80s. So initially, you had antibodies that were basically for mice that we thought, well, let's use them. We know that obviously generates a little bit of the immune system basically reacting to it when you give it to humans. So we then decided, well, we got much, much better at just engineering parts of it or changing it around. And one of the drugs that has been obviously highly successful is Rituxan from Roche. It was approved in the 90s, and just this year is seeing now the first competition on generics. So that's quite a long time. That has been very successful for Roche. But the other part that people look at or forget, or not forget, but basically it's important, is there's different other iterations of this drug that have been made that now are quite successful for the company. And we still haven't finished. So that should be 2018 here. There comes another one, which is a bispecific, a CD20 with a CD3 as well. And so you see how much these, I guess, franchises can develop over time, and what through engineering and through progress in innovation has happened in this space. But the question to us as an investor, or to me particularly, is what's next? Where is the innovation going, and what's happening, and where should I put my money, or money of my client, really? So that's been a picture that I think tells a lot of different stories. So on one hand, we have these new antibodies, this whole area of new therapeutic modalities. And I think recently, I think it was the chief scientist at Amgen said, you know, the way he reckons they operate is they look at the drug target. So it's all about the drug target, and they don't care what treatment modality they have. So they had I think it was a cardiovascular target, a new target, and they said, well, what we did, we made small molecules against it, we made antibodies against it, we made different kind of scaffolds against it, we made siRNAs against it, we're looking at editing and every possible thing, and that's kind of the division that they do. So it's no longer the division, we just look at the disease or we just have antibody technology. It's about we have to have all the tools, and I think AstraZeneca themselves said that as well. That's what we need to have. So how do they get that? Usually through partnerships or acquisitions. But that's been quite a change in what people have to do. And for us as an investor, that offers you a lot of different investment opportunities. And often what the street does is it likes to bet one horse. So it just says, well, this company is the only one that's going to succeed because of X, Y, Z. In reality, that's never the case, because not one thing can do. I think some may remember when immuno-oncology was started, on Wall Street it was all about Bristol Myers Squibb is the only one that's going to succeed. They will take over lung cancer and it's just them. Well, it's very different today, and it's not just one company. So always have to keep in mind, you know, CRISPR is now the only next big thing, none of this other gene editing. So it's always one thing. And by sitting away from the street, really, you kind of can step back and say, no, let's look at what it actually is. What is it all about? So that's kind of what I do. And out of that, I basically come across AdAlta. And AdAlta, what do they do? So they fit nicely into what's happened next in this. I wouldn't even call it antibody era. I think it's kind of the next era, and I don't know whether you could call it antibody because some are not antibodies, but it's about maybe protein therapeutics, you ever want to call it. So this is kind of what I would look at as the novel engineered structures. So some of these structures, these are all different, almost all different companies if you look at. So on the left side you see that they all still look like the antibody, like an epsilon that there is. So for example, you've got the nanobody, so everyone will have heard of Blinks by now. You've got here Micromet Byte, which is now part of Amgen. You've got, some of these others tend to find themselves in, particularly in Roche, who likes to look at this quite closely, and other companies. Then on the right side, you've got the so-called non-immune globulin scaffolds, this seems to be called. So these are scaffolds that work a little bit like antibodies. They have kind of structures like that, but they all look differently. So they don't have this epsilon structure anymore. So we just put them in the other basket. So here again, I might go on the other side. You've got again, so each of them is almost a different company. So this is a bicycle company in the UK working with AstraZeneca. This is Pieris, anticalins, Antibodies, Affimed, so all of these different kind of scaffolds find themselves in one company. And all of these companies tend to have obviously partnerships or trying to have partnerships, but that's kind of where we're going. But then I sometimes look at, people always then ask, well, which one is then the best? Well, I think each of them will have a home, each of them will find their target, and maybe some will fall over, but I think it's far too early to say, well, this one is working and this isn't. We will see that in the clinic. But I think at the moment, you see all these big pharma companies or big biotech all juggling for position and trying to put their bets and try and get as many of these technologies in-house or work with them as they can. So for me, that sometimes is difficult, but you then go back as an investor and say, well, what's the valuation? How much do I pay for this? And that's kind of where we get back to AdAlta, because from a valuation point of view, it's very interesting. The other part that, this is not really, can't really see this, but anyway, the other part that's to investors very interesting is ultimately what target are they working on. So it's not just the technology, it's also what you're actually working on, how do you choose your target. And I think these all show you the different scaffolds, what kind of targets they're working on, but you can't really see that. But that's one of the, I think, where people then also focus on. So these are now examples of what happens to stocks. So in the end, my job is to make money for my clients. So I have to relate that back to what does it mean on the share market, how does the street look at this. So this is a company called Morphosis, who sits in Germany, and they make antibodies. They know how to make antibodies, they've made that for many years, and as you see, you can almost get bored for a long, long time. So nothing happens. Well, there's little iterations, but nothing drastically happens. And this company was very focused on having obviously partners to help them, or partners where they maybe do a service for them to make antibodies. One of the close partnerships was with Novartis, one is also with Johnson & Johnson, one is with Roche, so several other. They basically decided, well, we do this service type model. But over time, that's great, but there is no real, as an investor, you look like, well, you have to have some kind of ownership in something. So there was a change in 2012 or end of 2012 where things started to happen, and we knew there was a drug coming through, was an antibody against CD38, and we knew that for multiple myeloma was becoming interesting. And one of his competitors, Genmab, had a deal with J&J on CD38, and people saw that drug is doing something. So everyone had said, well, Morphosis, you have that, what are you going to do? So they then did a deal with Celgene, because Celgene was obviously leading multiple myeloma, but didn't have the CD38. So they did the deal, and suddenly everyone thought, wow, you've got something else other than a service agreement. So things started to go, really got excited. Suddenly analysts write about it. I thought this was the best thing since sliced bread. And they did another deal with GSK on a different asset. And that kind of caused quite a bit of stir. So the share price then runs up, usually gets ahead of itself. And then we started to see, well, this Celgene thought, oh, we can't win this race against J&J anymore. They're moving quite quick. This is not really differentiated, so gave it back. So then people thought, oh no, this company has nothing. And you then get this whole roll-off, but what then happened is the next asset comes through, and people look at the pipeline again. And also we had now for this company an asset approved by the FDA for J&J, so they're now getting royalties. They just got breakthrough therapy designation for their anti-CD19, and then Roche also put the antibodies for Alzheimer's disease into phase 3. So suddenly this company is back again. So we have held it at times here, got bored, as you do, and then we went back in and then basically play this kind of up and down. And usually over time, this company should essentially, I would think, will be acquired. It just probably takes time, but at some stage someone will probably step in, as we've seen with Ablinks. So for us as a long-term investor, you can play these things, but for companies it's important to think about partnerships are not that bad if they're done the right way. And secondly, it's all about, investors tend to look at, well, what's the target? What do you have? So that's kind of like what this kind of type shows you. The other one, which is probably quite closer to AdAlta, is Empirus. Again, a company that makes so-called anticalins, other scaffolds. They, again, you see this like listed. People probably promise all sorts of things. Then people get bored and thought, well, this is not really happening. Things take longer, as usual, and they disappear. And then again, an announcement from AstraZeneca, and suddenly the thing gets put on the map. People analyze it. People suddenly write their initiation reports, and things take off. This company is today 342 million market cap, has about 86 million in cash. From an investor point of view, I still think this is pretty interesting. And is something that, for example, I want to do some work on because it is still pretty uncovered. And you may get a dip, but you don't have to rush it, really, because it's just a bit too much excitement. The other one that is very topical today is uplinks. So, and that's a very interesting chart, how things can move very quickly. So this has really gone nowhere for quite a while. And it was a company where people said, yeah, great, you have all these partnerships, but again, license it all off. And yeah, these nanobodies, all good. And if I go back to last year, so in 2015, Sanofi, who now has acquired this company last week, they started a deal with them on MS. They obviously liked each other. They then did a bigger announcement last year on another deal in inflammatory, which I think is ultimately the driver, because I don't think they wanted this company to go to anyone else, particularly not Novo Nordisk. So I think what happened here, so these all work together, and then what happened is the big inflection point was, again, the data that they had for phase 3. And suddenly everyone likes it, and then in the end, a spike comes through M&A. But what I'm trying to say is, particularly for investors, is patience is required in this. And the other part is these things never get discovered early. So we had another example, which I didn't put out, where we had invested in Genmab for a long time, and it was, I think, 500 million market cap. And this was not covered. And when you talk to, it sits in Denmark, and when you talk to US analysts who cover all these antibody technologies, all these new things, and you ask them, well, what do you think about Genmab? And they basically say to you, oh, I don't cover them, I don't know them. It's like, well, you're supposedly doing the antibodies. Yeah, but they sit in Europe, and that doesn't really, we don't know. And you then say, well, that's great, because not uncovered, that's perfect. So this company is at the moment valued at 10 billion, has this drug that J&J sells, and now every analyst covers them, tries to defend them, says how good the valuation is and how important it is. But it's essentially that herd mentality. So what we're trying to do, particularly with AdAlta, is you want to be early. Yeah, you have to give more money and you probably get diluted a little bit more, but in the end, that's where you then ultimately make those 10 baggers that everyone wants, because you just go on the journey and you understand that more, rather than jump in. I think at the moment, jump into the CRISPR, everyone talks about CRISPR, jump into RNAi just because Alnylam is now going to have a product. We were in Alnylam when I first got to platinum, so that's many years ago, 2004, made some money and then left. Yeah, you can say you should go back. But now to go in when it's almost 12 billion is, I think the risks are much higher. So that's kind of like where an investor comes from. And partnerships. Often I get when I say to people, well, why wouldn't you do a partnership? They're like, no, we don't want to sell out. We can't, we just hand it over, they don't help us. But if you look back, some of the partnerships are actually quite good. So one of them is obviously Roche and Genentech, that has basically made Roche into what it is today. The other one that obviously Sanofi has been trying to do the same thing with Regeneron. That's kind of working, let's put it that way. Obviously they want to do something else now, given their acquisitions. And the other one that I find very interesting, which is a bit unusual, is Incyte. Now we've been shareholders of Incyte since 2004, so a long time on the journey with this company. And they announced a alliance with Merus, small, I think it's a Dutch company we own as well. But they basically did an alliance, very small company, and said, well, we want to have these antibodies. So they do bispecific antibodies, and said, well, although Incyte is 20 billion, it's not a pharma company or a big biotech company, but it says, well, we have to build for the future. And I think that's quite important. I think we may see that a little bit more. And I think those relationships where they make an equity investment but let you be who you are, I think are very important, and probably more so important for smaller companies. So that's it from me, I think. No, there's one more. So the other thing that's happening, why I think that a lot more technology companies with platform will be even more in demand, is this is a chart of how the product life cycle these days, you can't really see it that well, it has changed. So these are particular targets. So if you look at HER2, when Herceptin was approved, the time that a competitor or a potential competitor in Tykerb came on the market was many, many years. And then the next one, so Herceptin was left alone for quite some time. If you now go down here, the PARP inhibitors today, the time that approval happened for, so we had Lynparza first, but then it was so quick that the rest was approved, that your product life cycle is so different. You have to be pedal much faster to really get your next drug. You have to come up with things much, much quicker than you have before. And I think everyone works on a similar target. So everyone is now trying to be faster, and somehow have some differentiation to actually get pricing, reimbursement the way they want it. So this is something that I think not just investors grapple, I think big pharma and big biotech, everyone grapples with that, how do we do this? And I think on top of that, you've got 1,000+ combination therapies in immuno-oncology. Everyone is coming out with the new, how can we make this cold tumor hot and what can we do? And that is very challenging for companies and for investors alike. So I think that will drive even more focus on, we need to have these things in-house, we have to move faster. We've seen now that a lot of people have come up with their own PD-1s just because they need to do the combinations themselves. And I think that has changed the way things are done, and now with tax changes in the US, you will see more acquisitions, I think, and much faster. That's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes?
Yeah, Bianca, how much time do you spend thinking about how differentiated a novel medical technology would be, say a protein engineering technology, versus how differentiated a product would be that emerges from that differentiated technology? To make a distinction, you spend a lot of time focusing on what could be achieved clinically?
You do. The one thing is that people always think, okay, you spend a week on whatever and you try and understand this. I think to me it's much more a journey where you go on and you try and learn on the go really what's going on and try to talk to as many people as possible. I think you have to do both. You can't just say, oh, the technology is great. You also have to understand the biology. You have to understand where does it fit. I think one of the challenges I find at the moment is when I look at, tried to do the exercise the other day saying like, well, tell me what's melanoma? Where is immuno-oncology going up to? So everyone obviously is waiting for the IDO data from Insight and Merck. And so you look at it and no one can really tell you, well, what is the response rate? What happened here? What happened there? There's so much going on that you actually, hardly anyone, even if you talk to doctors, everyone has a different opinion. And these days it's more about, I think there's lots more experimental work going on in humans, if you want to call it that way, but to actually understand what's going on. So there's no straight answer to that. It's more a journey that you go on and you try and, I guess, absorb as much as you can to understand it on both sides, on target as well as the competitive environment. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment about Rituxan. It was actually discovered and developed in San Diego by a little company called Pharmaceuticals that did a deal with Genentech, and then Genentech did a deal with Roche. And they were developing, that was novel technology, and they were developing it in the face of skepticism right through the industry. Everybody said antibodies are horrible. What are you doing spending time on monoclonal antibodies? And they helped. Yeah,
it's amazing.
Forge a path.
Yeah, but it's always like that. It's always the siRNA was like, oh, what is going to take? Or if you look at now it's called Ionis, but how Stanley Crook has like persisted so long, and now that's what he's been there 30 years, and now everyone tells me how Ionis is. You've got to invest in it. It's like, gee, yeah, it's been around for a long time, and maybe you have to invest in it now. But people forget these waves, they come and go, and that's why history is so important to see what happened. And as an investor, because you can punt if you want, but in the end that's just not the way I do it.
The other point about Rituxan is that nobody believed that the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma market was very big.
That's
they estimated
correct.
The market at around 253 million a year.
Used to buy that much.
Yeah.
And Rituxan's a $5 billion a year
yes,
drug.
And it keeps giving.
So the lesson there is don't let the tail wag the
No.
dog.
It's always, and I think the other, what was it at the moment? I think if you go to Lipitor, the cardiovascular, the prediction for those markets were pretty small.
Yeah.
And analysts how do they know? They don't. And I think rare disease is a good example. We now, what is it, the amyloidosis, TTR amyloidosis, everyone's saying, well, it's small now. There's numbers thrown around, $4 billion market, this $1 billion market. I had the other day someone in my office when Sanofi did the deal with Virology for hemophilia, saying to me, oh, but hemophilia is a tiny market. And I thought, well, I would have another look and look closely, and the prophylactic part of it. It's that mindset that analysts jump in, whoever's in the room, sorry, that jump in. And I think as an investor, you have to have the confidence to step away and do your own. Yes?
I'm intrigued that you didn't mention CAR T as one of the next big things.
I did. I have that. I call it. The other thing I try not to do is to fall into buzzwords. I call it the modified T cells. So, yes. So.
And follow up different question. Morphosis intrigued me because all the first generation antibody platforms got knocked off in the first decade of the century. But Morphosis persisted as a boring old company, and then suddenly comes to life. And you attribute it to CD38.
At the time, that's when people, when people like me, investors, or not like me, but other investors got interested, because a lot of people just look at, yeah, you're a platform, and that's always has a bit of a negative, yeah, platform. You just have to validate yourself, and you only get the validation if a big pharma does a deal with you, and if you have an asset. So in the end, your valuation tends to increase when you have your own asset. It's the same with Seattle Genetics. It's the same with other Xencor, whatever you want to call it. And then everyone will fall in love with your platform. But it's never the other way around. And it's also, I think we talked about it yesterday over dinner, is people also forget to look at, well, how do you manufacture this? How much is manufacturing? How hard is it? You know, if you now look at these bispecifics, and you go onto, for example, Roche's website, how they talk about the technology or the innovation that goes into actually manufacturing these very more complex molecules, and people forget that. So there's all facets to it. But yeah, biotech lends itself to punters who want to make a quick buck, but in the end, that can also lose you a lot of money very quickly.
Bianca, sorry,
Yes.
I was just wondering, I'm an analyst, so I'll take this with a grain of salt.
Sorry.
I was wondering how much time you spent, you talked a lot about the science and targets and technologies and platforms, science forward. How much do you spend market backwards, meaning the opportunity? You said that Roche is under generic attack for rituximab right now. There's a lot of reimbursement concerns, a lot of competition.
Yeah.
What's a sexy market opportunity, and then go back to the science, see what's the best platform instead of moving from the
Yeah, you do that.
forward?
So I'm a virologist. So I worked on HIV and worked on herpes viruses. So one of the things where that worked, but that totally going the other way, where I said, well, hepatitis C, that is a big thing. And so we at the time then said, well, who is in this space? Who's doing something? And so we came across Pharmaset. So invested in pharma said, well, they have these nucleotides, they know what they're doing, and that's good. Sorry?
Good.
Yeah, that's good. So then we said, well, that's a good thing. What we also did is we then travel around, go to these companies and ask them, and obviously one that should have been in this area was Gilead. So we spoke to them. They hired then, can't remember, I think he was Mr. Norbert Bischofsberger, who I think is the liver man there. So we thought, well, that's a bit strange, HIV and liver, so you must have some interest here. And at the time, Gilead was all worried about generics and whatever, and so we thought, no, we believe this is hepatitis C. So it came from that side. So it's both. You look at respiratory disease. So we feel that respiratory disease, there's lots happening. So that's why we, for example, have been in AstraZeneca. Totally the opposite when other people thought that was, a dead company, not working. So yeah, we do that as well.
Could you say, including my myopic view, can you say what areas are hot right now as far as the disease states?
Top of my head, let me think about this. I think, for example, I think robotic, which is totally different, but I think robotic is something. So you have a company, that Intuitive Research, Intuitive Surgery, that basically has the only robotic kind of platform out there. But there's others coming. So without saying any names, there is now another one out there that may not be with so many bangs and whistles, but I think surgery, laparoscopic surgery has been great, but I think there is now people want to have these robotics to do it with. So let's put it that way, because some people think it's surgery will be done, the robot does it just by itself. That's not the case. The robot assists the surgeon. So that, I think, is a field that will change. So we've been looking to try and position there. Overall, robotics, for example, in general, in manufacturing, in areas is interesting. In terms of immune oncology, I think is interesting. You can't dismiss it. So, but then I do think the scaffolds are interesting in terms of what diseases. Not on the top of my head, there is not one that stands out.
Fibrosis?
Well, yes, that is. So, but that's yeah.
Second trial.
It's a big fibrosis is big.
Can I just say, there's a push to go into rare diseases
Yeah.
is one area. And fibrosis is definitely an emerging area. Anywhere where there's a significant unmet medical need, you're going to find pharmaceutical and biotech companies in there.
Do you think, Rob, do you think that was changed though with Trump and the whole focus on costing? You saw the State of the Union and he said, watch this space, blah, 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 whatever. Is that a problem, or do you think the rare diseases are more immune?
Is Trump a problem, are you asking?
That's right. I think one area that I find interesting is blood diseases. So, and I think what Sanofi is doing that is an interesting. Let's say sickle cell anemia or other forms of where basically your blood cells don't form well. I think there is some activity going on there. But again, it is that rare disease. But you have to, if you have time, read the conference transcript from Sanofi when they're bought by Robotics and Ublinks, what they're saying, and it's quite interesting how they look at it, because they buy this because you have a small sales force, it's a very different marketing. So while we're going from primary care to specialty, we're now going to these other Genzyme-like approaches, because that's where they can save costs, and that's what they ultimately have to do. So.